In the heart of Pennsylvania's Amish country, a poor farmer named Elias Yoder discovers something impossible in his woods. Chained to an ancient oak tree stands a horse, unlike any he has ever seen, 17 hands high, black as midnight, with eyes that seem to hold ancient knowledge. A weathered note hangs from its neck with a simple warning: keep it fed, never let it free. What begins as an act of simple Christian charity soon becomes a nightmare that threatens everything Elias holds dear. His wheat grows taller overnight. His neighbors hear voices in the darkness. His own children begin speaking in languages they never learned. Was this magnificent creature a blessing from God or something far more sinister? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun had barely crested the horizon when Elias Yoder stepped onto his porch, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of dried corn stalks and wood smoke. His calloused hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with weak coffee, the third reuse of yesterday's grounds. Times had been lean, and waste was a sin he could not afford. Behind him, through the weathered wooden door, he could hear Sarah moving about the kitchen, her practiced steps creating a familiar rhythm that had marked 30 years of marriage. The floorboards creaked in that particular way that told him she was kneading bread dough, her strong arms working the mixture with the same determination she applied to every aspect of their life together. Their farmhouse stood modest and plain, as befitting their 2 stories of hand-hewn timber, painted white long ago but now showing the grey of bare wood in places where the weather had taken its toll. The roof needed repairs before winter, another expense he'd been putting off. The barn beside it leaned slightly to the east, a testament to the previous winter's heavy snows and his own failing strength. At 53, Elias felt every one of his years in his bones each morning. The farm itself sprawled across 47 acres, though only 20 remained productive. His wheat fields had yielded poorly these past 3 seasons, the soil seeming tired no matter how he rotated crops or rested the land. His small herd of dairy cows, down to just 4 now, grazed in the near pasture, their breath creating small clouds in the cool air. 2 draft horses, Sadie and Belle, stood in the paddock, their brown coats shaggy with their winter growth already coming in. "Papa," Hannah's voice rang out from inside, high and clear as a bell. At 8 years old, she remained the light of their home, untouched by the worries that pressed on her parents' shoulders. Her laughter could still make Elias forget, for a moment, the weight of unpaid bills and mortgage payments. "In a moment, little one," he called back, allowing himself another sip of the bitter coffee. The community of Ironwood Valley stretched out before him in the growing light. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, marking the homes of his neighbors and fellow believers. The Byler farm to the north, the Fisher place to the south, and beyond them the homes of the Lapp family, the Zooks, the Millers, and so many others who had known him since childhood. This land had been in his family for 5 generations. His great-great-grandfather had cleared these fields with his own hands, living first in a dugout shelter while he built the barn, then the house. Each generation had added something, improved something, passed down not just property but a way of life rooted in simplicity, faith, and community. The screen door creaked open, and Sarah emerged, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. At 51, her face showed the lines of a life lived outdoors and in service, but her grey eyes remained clear and penetrating. She had a way of looking at him that suggested she could read his very thoughts. "You're troubled this morning," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded slowly. "Johan's funeral is this afternoon. I keep thinking about his family, about Martha and the children. They're worse off than we are now." Johann Stoltzfus had died 3 days prior, his heart giving out while he worked his fields. He'd been younger than Elias, only 48. The community would provide for his widow, as was their way, but it would be difficult for everyone. Martha had 7 children, the youngest just 3 years old. We'll take them the ham from the smokehouse, Sarah said firmly, and 2 jars of the preserved peaches. Sarah, that's what we'll do, she interrupted gently, but with finality. We have enough. We always have enough, because the Lord provides. Her faith had always been stronger than his own, Elias thought. Not that he doubted God, but sometimes he wondered about the fairness of it all. Good men like Johann dying young, families struggling while doing everything right, following every rule, living every day in service and humility. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced their children's descent for breakfast. Ruth came first, their eldest at 16, her dark hair already pinned beneath her prayer cap, her movements graceful and measured. She had her mother's thoughtful eyes and her father's quiet disposition. Lately, Elias had noticed a restlessness in her, a tendency to stare out windows toward the road that led to town, to ask questions about the world beyond their valley. Jacob followed close behind, 13 and already nearly as tall as his father. The boy had inherited Elias's broad shoulders and strong hands, taking to farm work with a natural ease that filled his father with pride. Where Ruth questioned, Jacob accepted. Where she wondered, he believed. He would make a fine farmer someday, a stalwart member of the community. Hannah burst into the kitchen last, her energy boundless despite the early hour. Her blonde braids bounced as she rushed to hug her father's legs, nearly spilling his coffee. "Papa, can I help you with the chores today? Please, I want to feed the chickens and collect the eggs and see if Belle's leg is better, and, Hannah, let your father breathe." Sarah chided gently, but she smiled as she said it. "Come help me set the table." They gathered around the worn wooden table that had served the family for generations, its surface marked with decades of knife cuts and water rings, each imperfection a small history. Elias led them in prayer, his deep voice speaking the familiar German words that connected them to centuries of ancestors, who had spoken the same blessing over bread and milk. The morning meal was simple: dark bread with butter, scrambled eggs from their hens, and fresh milk still warm from the morning milking. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the crackling of the wood stove in the corner. "I'll need to go into the woods today," Elias said as he finished his bread. "We're low on firewood for winter, and there's a stand of dead elms on the North 40 that should come down before they fall on their own." Sarah's brow furrowed slightly. "Those woods, you'll be careful." "It's just trees, Sarah. It's just trees that our people have avoided for 100 years, she countered. "There's a reason the old property line stopped at the creek bed." Elias had heard the stories, of course. Every child in the valley grew up with whispered tales about the deep woods that bordered their properties, the place where the trees grew too close together, where game animals refused to venture, where hunters sometimes heard sounds that had no earthly source. But these were just stories, weren't they? The fears of superstitious old men and over-imaginative children. "I'm not afraid of shadows and old wives' tales," Elias said, perhaps more sharply than he intended. "We need the wood, and dead elms burn hot and clean. I'll take the wagon and the saw. Be back before dark." Ruth looked up from her plate, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Papa, maybe Jacob could go with you. It's a lot of work for one man." "I need Jacob here to help repair the paddock fence," Sarah interjected quickly. "The posts are rotting, and we can't risk the horses getting out." The conversation ended there, as it always did when Sarah made a decision. After breakfast, Elias hitched Belle to the wagon, the old mare snorting softly as he adjusted her harness. He loaded his hand saw, an axe, rope, and a canteen of water. The morning had grown warmer, and by noon it would be genuinely pleasant for October. He guided Belle along the dirt path that wound through his property, past the wheat fields where stubble from the recent harvest stood in neat rows, past the corner where he planned to plant corn next spring, and toward the tree line that marked the edge of the cultivated land. The forest beyond had always seemed darker than it should, even in daylight. The trees there were old, gnarled things with trunks as wide as a man was tall, As they approached the woods, Belle's ears flattened against her skull. She slowed her pace without being told, her hooves dragging slightly in the dirt. Elias felt it too, though he would never admit it, a sense of wrongness, of entering a place where he did not belong. The temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees as they passed beneath the canopy. The forest pressed in around them, dense and silent in a way that felt unnatural. Elias had hunted these woods as a younger man, knew them better than most, yet today they felt foreign. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered warnings at their approach. Even the wind seemed to have died the moment they crossed into the shadows. Belle stopped completely, refusing to go farther, despite Elias's gentle urging. He climbed down from the wagon seat, patting her neck reassuringly. "All right, old girl, you wait here. I'll walk the rest of the way." He took his saw and axe, leaving the rope coiled in the wagon bed. The stand of dead elms wasn't far, maybe a quarter-mile deeper into the woods. He'd spotted them last spring while tracking a wounded deer. The trees would be perfect, dry enough to burn immediately, but not so rotted as to be worthless. His boots crunched through fallen leaves, the sound absurdly loud in the oppressive quiet. Overhead, the canopy blocked most of the sunlight, creating a twilight gloom that made him check his pocket watch to confirm it was still morning. His fingers traced the smooth wood of the hand-carved Bible box he kept in his coat pocket, a habit from childhood. The small box, no bigger than his palm, had been his grandfather's. Inside were 3 tiny scraps of parchment with verses written in fading ink. He'd carried it every day for 40 years. Something about holding it now brought him comfort as he walked deeper into a place that seemed to resist his very presence. The ground beneath his feet changed gradually from soft forest loam to something harder, rockier. He passed trees that looked ancient, their bark thick and deeply furrowed, their roots breaking through the earth like arthritic fingers reaching for the sky. Then he saw them, the dead elms, standing like grey sentinels in a small clearing. But his attention wasn't drawn to the trees. Instead, his eyes fixed on something that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist, yet stood before him as real as the ground beneath his feet. The oak tree dominated the clearing, its trunk easily 15 feet across, its branches reaching toward the canopy like desperate arms. Elias had never seen it before, though he would have sworn he'd been to this exact spot a dozen times, and chained to that oak, thick iron links, wrapped multiple times around both the tree and the creature's neck, stood a horse that defied all reasonable explanation. It was massive. Elias had raised horses his entire life, had seen the largest draft breeds at county fairs and cattle auctions, but this animal made them look like ponies. 17 hands high at least, maybe 18, its coat a black so pure it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect. Its mane fell in thick waves past its neck, and its tail nearly touched the ground. Steam rose from its nostrils in the cool air, each breath slow and measured. But it was the eyes that held him frozen. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were knowing, intelligent, and infinitely old. They fixed on Elias with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. His first instinct was to run, to get Belle and ride back to the farm as fast as the old mare could carry him. But his legs wouldn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, staring at this impossible creature that stared back with equal intensity. Then he noticed the note, a piece of paper, yellowed with age but somehow intact, despite exposure to the elements, hung from a leather cord around the horse's neck. The handwriting was precise, old-fashioned, written in the formal German script his grandparents had used. Keep it fed, never let it free. That was all. 6 words that seemed to carry the weight of commandments. Elias's practical mind began working despite his fear. Someone had chained this horse here. Someone had left this note. That meant there was a rational explanation, even if he couldn't immediately see it. Perhaps a wealthy Englisher had abandoned an exotic breed. Perhaps this was someone's idea of a cruel joke, but even as he formed these thoughts, he knew they were lies he told himself to maintain sanity, in the face of something beyond his understanding. The chains, he could see now, were covered in rust and verdigris, suggesting they'd been here far longer than any horse could survive without care. The horse shifted slightly, the chains clinking with a sound like distant church bells. Its muscles rippled beneath that midnight coat, suggesting a strength that could snap those iron links like thread if it chose to. Yet it stood patient, almost expectant, as Elias slowly approached. His hand trembled as he reached out, stopping just short of touching the note. Up close, he could see symbols etched into the edges of the paper, not letters exactly, but marks that seemed to shift when he looked at them directly. They reminded him of something he'd seen once in a book at the community library, drawings of old Indian writing. The horse lowered its great head, bringing those impossibly intelligent eyes level with his own. Elias felt something pass between them in that moment, a communication without words. The creature wasn't pleading or threatening, it was simply waiting. It had been waiting for a very long time. "Who are you?" Elias whispered, the question escaping before he could stop it. The horse exhaled through its nostrils, and the sound carried a weight of sadness that made Elias's chest ache. He looked again at the chains, following them around the oak's massive trunk. The bark had grown over parts of the links, suggesting decades, perhaps centuries of imprisonment. How was any of this possible? He circled the tree slowly, examining the chains from different angles. They were forged in a style he'd never seen, thick, heavy, with symbols stamped into the metal itself. The same strange markings from the paper, repeated over and over along the length of each link. Where the chains touched the oak, the bark had blackened and died, leaving deep grooves in the ancient wood. Behind the tree he found more bones scattered in the leaf litter. Not human, thank God, but deer bones, raccoon skulls, the remains of smaller creatures. Had the horse killed them? No, he realized as he knelt to examine them more closely. They were too old, weathered by years of exposure. These animals had come here and died of natural causes, or perhaps something else entirely. The Bible box in his pocket suddenly felt hot against his chest. He pulled it out, opening it with fingers that no longer trembled. The 3 scraps of scripture inside seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. One verse caught his eye, written in his grandfather's careful hand, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." Was this such a power? Or was it something caught between, something that needed help rather than fear? Elias made his decision. He would return home, gather supplies, and come back. If this creature had survived this long without food or water, surely it could wait a few more hours. But in his heart he knew the truth. He wouldn't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Not until he understood more. He tucked the Bible box away and backed slowly from the clearing, keeping his eyes on the horse. It watched him go with something that might have been approval in its ancient gaze. When he reached the tree line, he turned and walked quickly back to where Belle waited. The old mare seemed relieved to leave, pulling the wagon with more energy than she'd shown in months. Elias guided her back through the fields toward home, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. The dead elms forgotten, the firewood uncut. He returned to his family with a secret that weighed heavier than any burden he'd carried before. As the farmhouse came into view, he saw Sarah standing on the porch, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun to watch his approach. Even from a distance he knew she could read him. 30 years of marriage had given her an uncanny ability to sense when something troubled him. He would tell her eventually. He told Sarah everything, had promised on their wedding day never to keep secret. But for now, just for a few hours, he needed to think, to pray, to understand what God or fate or something else entirely had placed in his path this day. The bishop's words from last Sunday's sermon echoed in his mind, Every man faces tests of faith, moments when the path forward is unclear. In these times we must trust in the Lord's wisdom and seek guidance through prayer and contemplation. Bishop Nathaniel Stoltzfus had a way of speaking that suggested he knew more than he said, as if the old man carried secrets of his own. Elias unhitched Belle with hands that shook despite his efforts to steady them. The mare nuzzled his shoulder, sensing his distress, and he leaned against her warm flank for a moment, drawing comfort from her familiar presence. Through the kitchen window he could see Sarah moving about, preparing the midday meal. Hannah's laughter drifted out from somewhere inside, innocent and carefree. How could he explain what he'd seen? Even to himself it seemed impossible. Yet the image of that massive horse, those knowing eyes, the ancient chains, remained burned into his memory with perfect clarity. He hadn't imagined it. The Bible box in his pocket, still warm against his chest, seemed to pulse with a gentle heat that confirmed the reality of his discovery. He walked to the well and drew up a bucket of cold water, drinking deeply before splashing some on his face. The chill helped clear his thoughts. Whatever that creature was, it had been chained there for a reason. The note had been clear: keep it fed, never let it free. Someone, at some point in the distant past, had made the decision to imprison it. But why? And for how long? "Elias," Sarah called from the doorway. "Dinner's ready. Did you find your elms?" He wiped his face on his sleeve and walked toward the house, formulating a response. "Found something else instead. I'll tell you after we eat." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded and returned inside. Sarah knew when to press and when to give him space, another gift of their long marriage. The meal was simple but filling: chicken soup thick with vegetables from their garden, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and apple butter that Hannah had helped make last week. Elias forced himself to eat, knowing he needed the strength for what he planned to do next. "Papa, you're quiet," Ruth observed, her sharp eyes studying his face. "Did something happen in the woods?" "Just thinking," he replied, perhaps too quickly, about the funeral this afternoon, about Johan's family. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had been thinking about death, about time, about how quickly life could change. But his mind kept returning to that clearing, to the creature that waited there in eternal patience. After the meal, Elias excused himself to the barn. He gathered a pail of oats, some hay, and a canvas bag he filled with apples from their small orchard. If he was going to feed this thing, he'd do it properly. Animals deserved care, even impossible ones. Sarah found him as he was filling a water jug at the pump. She stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the afternoon light. "You're going back there," she said. "I am. Will you tell me why?" He set down the jug and turned to face her fully. "I found something in the woods, something I don't understand, but it needs help, and I can't just leave it there." "What kind of something?" "A horse, but not like any horse you've ever seen. It's chained to a tree, Sarah. It's been there a long time, maybe longer than seems possible. And there was a note." He pulled the yellowed paper from his pocket, having taken it from the creature's neck before leaving the clearing. Sarah took it carefully, her fingers tracing the old German script. "Keep it fed," she read aloud. "Never let it free." Her eyes met his. "Elias, this is old. Very old. Look at the paper, the way the words are formed. This could be from my grandmother's time or before." "I know. And you're planning to feed it anyway. What else can I do? It's a living thing, Sarah. Chained there, helpless. If someone put it there with these instructions, maybe they meant for someone to care for it." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying her husband's face. Finally, she sighed. "You always did have too much compassion for your own good. That's why I married you, I suppose. But Elias, be careful. There's a reason those woods have a bad reputation. Our elders, your grandfather, they all avoided that place. If this horse is there, If it's been there as long as this note suggests, then perhaps the chains are for a reason. I considered that, but I looked into its eyes, Sarah, and I saw pain, loneliness. Not evil. You can't know what's in the heart of such a thing, Sarah said softly. Promise me you'll be cautious. Promise me you won't try to free it, no matter what. I promise. She helped him load the supplies onto a small hand cart, the kind they used for hauling hay to the far pastures. As he prepared to leave, she grabbed his arm tightly. If you're not back before dark, I'm sending Jacob and the Fisher boys to find you. I'll be back, he assured her, kissing her forehead. An hour, maybe 2 at most. The journey back into the woods felt different in the afternoon light. Shadows stretched longer, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The cart's wheels caught on roots and rocks, making progress slow. By the time Elias reached the clearing, he was breathing hard from the exertion. The horse stood exactly as he'd left it, motionless except for the gentle rise and fall of its massive chest. Its head turned as he approached, those ancient eyes following his every movement. Elias set down the cart and pulled out the oats first, approaching slowly with the pail held out before him. Easy now, he murmured, using the same tone he employed with his own horses. I brought you something to eat. The creature lowered its head to the pail, sniffing cautiously before beginning to eat. Elias watched in fascination as it consumed the oats with delicate movements. Despite its enormous size, when the pail was empty, he offered the apples, which it took from his hand, one by one, its lips remarkably gentle against his palm. With the horse occupied, Elias took the opportunity to examine the chains more closely. They were unlike any he'd ever seen. The links were massive, each one thick as his wrist, forged from iron that had blackened with age, but showed no signs of rust or weakness. He touched one experimentally and pulled his hand back quickly. The metal was ice cold, despite the afternoon warmth, and touching it sent a strange tingling sensation up his arm. The symbols stamped into each link drew his attention. They weren't random decorations, he realized, but some kind of pattern or language. He'd seen similar markings once, years ago, when an English professor from the university had come to study the old native burial mounds along the river. The professor had shown him photographs of petroglyphs, ancient rock carvings left by the people who'd lived in these valleys long before the Amish arrived. These symbols matched those photographs exactly. Elias walked around the oak tree, counting the chains, 7 of them, each wrapped multiple times around both the tree and the horse's neck, creating a web of iron that seemed designed to hold something far more dangerous than a simple animal. Where the chains touched the bark, the wood had died and turned black, spreading like an infection into the tree's heartwood. Yet the oak still lived, still grew, as if locked in an eternal struggle with the metal that bound it. The horse finished the last apple and turned its attention back to Elias. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Then, impossibly, Elias felt something in his mind, not words exactly, but impressions, emotions, a sense of profound gratitude mixed with ancient sorrow. He staggered back, his heart pounding. The horse hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, yet Elias knew with absolute certainty that it had communicated with him somehow. And in that brief mental contact, he'd sensed something vast and terrible, a weight of years and experiences that made his own 53 years feel like a single heartbeat. "What are you?" he whispered. The horse didn't answer, if it even could, but Elias felt a change in the air around them, a subtle shift in the quality of light. The clearing suddenly seemed both larger and smaller than it had moments ago, as if the space itself had become fluid and uncertain. He looked down at his hands and noticed something impossible. The calluses and age spots, the rough skin earned from decades of hard labor, they looked different, smoother, younger. He touched his face and felt fewer lines around his eyes and mouth. No, that couldn't be right. It was a trick of the light, his imagination running wild in this strange place. He grabbed the cart handles and began backing away from the clearing, his supplies now empty but his mind filled with questions and growing fear. The walk home felt longer than it should have. Elias kept stopping to examine his hands in the fading light, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the change. But each time he looked, they appeared somehow different, not dramatically younger, but subtle enough to make him doubt his own memory. Had that scar from the sore accident last spring always been so faint? Had his knuckles always bent so easily? Sarah met him at the door, her eyes searching his face with concern. "You were longer than you said. Lost track of time," he replied, which was true enough. In that clearing, time itself had felt elastic, uncertain. She led him inside where the family had gathered for evening prayers. Hannah ran to him immediately, wrapping her small arms around his waist. The warmth of her embrace grounded him, brought him back to the solid reality of his life and home. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Elias sat with Sarah at the kitchen table, speaking in low voices about what he'd experienced. She listened without interruption, her face grave in the lamplight. "The symbols you described," she said finally. "My grandmother used to talk about such things. She was born here, before this was Amish land, back when English settlers still traded with the native people. She said they had ways of binding spirits, of protecting their land from things that walked between worlds." Spirits? Elias felt his skepticism rising despite everything he'd seen. "Sarah, we're people of faith, not superstition. Are they so different?" She countered gently. "The Bible speaks of angels and demons, of powers and principalities. Perhaps what my grandmother's people called spirits were the same things, just named differently." She rose and disappeared into their bedroom, returning with a small leather-bound book he'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. "This was my grandmother's prayer book," Sarah explained, opening it carefully. She wrote notes in the margins, things her mother told her, things she learned from the old Indian woman who lived by the river. "Look here." She pointed at a passage written in faded ink, the handwriting shaky but readable. "She writes about signs and warnings, about gifts that come from darkness wearing the face of blessings, about crops that grow too fast, animals that act strange, children who speak in voices not their own." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. When did she write this? The date here says 1873. The same year, the settlement on Miller's Ridge disappeared. Sarah's finger traced the next entry. She writes, "The people took the gift without question. They fed the beast and thought themselves blessed. But blessings from shadows carry prices no man should pay. By the time they understood, it was too late. The land swallowed them whole, leaving only ashes and warnings." "You're saying the same thing happened before? That there was another horse?" "I'm saying there have always been things in these woods that we don't understand. Things our ancestors learned to avoid, to leave alone, and now you've involved yourself with one of them." Before Elias could respond, a sound pierced the night, a long, low howl that came from somewhere far off, but seemed to echo inside the house itself. Both he and Sarah froze, listening. It came again, and this time Hannah's voice cried out from upstairs. They rushed to her room to find the girl sitting up in bed, her eyes wide and unseeing. "He's calling," she whispered in a voice that didn't sound quite like her own. "He's calling and calling, so lonely, so hungry. He wants to be friends with everyone." "Hannah, wake up," Sarah said firmly, shaking her daughter's shoulders. "Wake up now." The girl blinked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mama, I had a bad dream. There was a big black horse and he was so sad. He said Papa brought him food and now he can finally talk to someone." Elias and Sarah exchanged a look of pure fear. How could Hannah know about the horse? He hadn't told the children, had barely told Sarah the full story. Yet here was their 8-year-old daughter, describing it in perfect detail. 3 days passed, and Elias found himself returning to the clearing each morning despite his growing unease. The horse seemed to expect him now, its great head turning at his approach with what he could only describe as recognition. Each time he brought food and water, each time he felt that strange mental connection, that wordless communication that left him both exhilarated and deeply troubled. And each time he noticed more change. His wheat field, which had yielded poorly for 3 seasons, suddenly showed growth that defied all agricultural logic. Stalks that had been stunted and brown on Monday stood tall and golden by Thursday, heavy with grain that shouldn't exist for another 3 months. He stood at the edge of the field, running his hands through wheat that should have been impossible, and felt both wonder and dread. Jacob noticed it too. The boy stood beside his father, his young face troubled. "Papa, this isn't natural. These are winter plantings. They shouldn't even be sprouting yet, much less ready for harvest." "I know, son. Is it because of what you found in the woods?" So Jacob knew, or suspected. Elias placed a hand on his son's broad shoulder. "I don't know what's happening, but whatever it is, we must be careful. We must watch and pray and trust that God will guide us." That evening, at the Stoltzfo's farm where the community gathered for a barn raising, Elias overheard conversations that made his blood run cold. Wilhelm Fischer, whose land bordered theirs to the south, spoke to a group of men about his cows. "They've stopped giving milk entirely," Wilhelm said, his weathered face creased with confusion. "Just stand in the field, staring east toward. That dark part of the woods. Won't eat, won't drink, just stare. My wife says it's unnatural, says we should slaughter them and be done with it." "Strange things all over the valley," old Heinrich Lapp added. "My daughter Rachel, she's only 6 years old, but yesterday she spoke a full sentence in some language none of us recognized. When I asked her where she learned such words, she said a voice in the barn taught her. A voice that comes at night." The men shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances heavy with unspoken worry. Bishop Stoltzfus stood among them, his white beard nearly reaching his chest, his eyes sharp despite his 70-some years. "The Lord tests us in many ways," the bishop said, his voice carrying the weight of it. "Perhaps we've grown complacent in our faith, too comfortable in our prosperity. These signs may be a call to greater devotion, to deeper prayer." But Elias saw the doubt in the old man's. The bishop knew, just as Elias knew, that something more than divine testing was at work in Ironwood Valley. After the barn raising, as families prepared to depart, Anna Beiler approached Elias with a haunted expression. She was a round woman with kind eyes, but today those eyes held fear. "Elias, may I speak plainly?" "Of course, Anna. My husband Carl. He's been walking the fields at midnight. I wake to find his side of the bed empty, and when I go to the window, I see him out there in the moonlight, just walking back and forth, making patterns in the dirt, and he's whispering something, over and over, but I can't make out the words. Have you asked him about it? He doesn't remember doing it, swears he sleeps through the night, but I've seen the mud on his feet come morning, the grass stains on his nightshirt. Something is calling our men out into the darkness, Elias, and I'm terrified of what it might be." She gripped his arm tightly. "You're a good man, Elias Yoder. You've always been kind to my family. If you know something, anything about what's happening, please tell us, help us." He wanted to confess everything in that moment, to unburden himself of the secret he'd been carrying. But before he could speak, he felt it, that presence in his mind, gentle but insistent, the horse's consciousness reaching across the distance between them. It wasn't threatening or demanding, it simply was, like a constant pressure at the back of his thoughts. "I'm sorry, Anna," he finally said. "I don't know what's happening either, but I will pray on it. We all will." She nodded, unconvinced but accepting, and moved away to join her family. Elias felt the weight of his deception like a stone in his chest. That night, Ruth appeared at his door as he prepared for bed. His eldest daughter had grown into a thoughtful young woman, observant in ways that sometimes unnerved him. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped before her, clearly struggling with something. "Papa, I followed you yesterday." His heart sank. "Ruth, please, let me speak. I followed you to the woods. I saw the horse, Papa, and I saw what it did to you. What it did. You looked younger when you came back. Your face, your hands. I thought I was imagining it at first, but Mama sees it too. And the wheat field, the things happening to the neighbors. It all started after you found that creature." She stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I need to see it again. I need to touch it, to understand. Because, Papa, I've been having dreams. Dreams where I see things that haven't happened yet, where I know things I shouldn't know. And in those dreams, there's always that horse, watching me with eyes full of secrets." "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. More dangerous than what's already happening," she challenged. "More dangerous than whatever is making children speak in tongues and grown men wander the fields at night. Papa, I think it's trying to tell us something. I think it needs help, and you're the only one who's listened." Before Elias could respond, a commotion erupted from downstairs. They rushed down to find Sarah holding Jacob, who thrashed and fought against her grip. The boy's eyes had rolled back in his head, showing only whites, and his mouth moved rapidly, forming words in that same unknown language the Lap girl had spoken. "Jacob!" Elias grabbed his son's shoulders, but the boy's strength was inhuman. He threw his father back with ease, sending Elias crashing into the table. Ruth screamed. Hannah appeared at the top of the stairs, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "He's just scared. The horse is scared. Papa, you have to go to him now. Something bad is in the woods with him." As suddenly as it had started, Jacob's convulsions stopped. He crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes returning to normal. "Papa," he wheezed, I saw men in the woods. Dark men. They're trying to break the chains." Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and a lantern, ignoring Sarah's protests. If someone was tampering with those chains, if they were trying to free that creature, the note's warning echoed in his mind. Never let it free. Ruth followed him to the door. "I'm coming with you. You'll stay here and help your mother with Jacob." "Papa, I can help. I know I can. Something inside me knows. Please." He looked into his daughter's eyes and saw the same determination he'd seen in Sarah's eyes on their wedding day. The same strength that had drawn him to her mother decades ago. Against his better judgment, he nodded. They moved quickly through the darkness, the lantern casting wild shadows as they ran. Elias had never been comfortable in these woods at night, but now they felt actively hostile. The trees seemed to lean toward them, their branches reaching like grasping fingers. Sounds that should have been familiar. Owl calls, the rustle of small animals took on sinister tones. As they neared the clearing, they heard voices. Men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones. Elias doused the lantern and motioned for Ruth to stay close. They crept forward until they could see through the undergrowth. 3 figures stood around the chained horse, and even in the darkness, Elias could tell something was wrong with them. They moved in jerky, unnatural ways, their heads tilting at angles no human neck should bend. One of them held tools, bolt cutters, a saw, a hammer. They were working on the chains, trying to break the ancient links. The horse reared back as far as the chains would allow, its eyes wide with what Elias could only interpret as terror. Whatever these men were, the creature feared them deeply. "Stop!" Elias shouted, stepping into the clearing without thinking. "Stop what you're doing!" The 3 figures turned in unison, their movement synchronized in a way that made his skin crawl. In the moonlight he could see their faces now, or rather what had been their faces. Wilhelm Fischer, Karl Beiler, and to his horror, Bishop Stoltz, but their eyes reflected light like animals, unnatural and wrong. Keeper, they spoke as one, their voices overlapping in a disturbing harmony. You have fed it. You have given it strength. Now we take what we need. You're not them, Ruth said, her voice surprisingly steady as she stepped beside her father. You're wearing them like clothes. Let them go. The figures laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. The girl sees, the girl knows, but she is too late. The chains weaken. The gate open. Soon, all will be ours. Bishop Stoltzfus's body moved forward, bolt cutters raised high. Elias had no weapon, no way to fight, but as the possessed man swung the heavy tool toward a chain, the horse made a sound. Not a whinny or a scream, but something deeper, something that vibrated in Elias's chest and made the air shimmer. The three figures froze, as if held by invisible hands. The horse's eyes began to glow with a soft golden light that grew brighter and brighter until Elias had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the possessed men had collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. The horse turned its luminous gaze to Elias and Ruth. This time the communication was clear, like words forming directly in their minds. They are only the first, more will come. The rift draws near its opening. 3 nights from now, when the moon is dark, it will try to tear through completely. You must decide, Keeper. Will you stand with me, or will you flee? What are you? Elias demanded aloud. What is this rift? What do you want from us? Images flooded his mind, not words but visions, memories that weren't his own. He saw this land thousands of years ago, pristine and wild. He saw people who lived in harmony with something vast and unknowable, a presence that existed between worlds. He saw a ritual, a binding, a guardian chosen to protect the boundary between what was and what should never be. He saw the guardian take the form that those who needed it most could understand, sometimes a great bird, sometimes a bear, sometimes a warrior. And in this age, to a simple Amish farmer who understood horses, it had appeared as the most magnificent horse he could imagine. But he also saw the other side, the darkness that pressed against the boundary, hungry and patient, things with no names, no forms, existing only to consume and corrupt. The entities that now wore his neighbors like masks. The chains, the horse's voice echoed in his mind, were never to keep me imprisoned. They were to keep me anchored, to bind me to this place so I could guard the gate. But time has weakened them. The one who forged them is long dead. Without a new keeper, someone to willingly share the burden, I will fail. And when I fail, your world will feed the darkness. Ruth gasped, her hand clutching her father's arm. She'd seen the same visions, felt the same terrible weight of understanding. How? Elias asked. How do we help you? The old ways are written in the land itself. The girl can read them. She has the gift her grandmother's grandmother possessed. 3 nights from now, when the moon is dark, there will be a choice, a sacrifice, a transformation. Until then, you must keep them away from the chains. You must protect me, Keeper, so that I can protect you all. The golden light faded. The horse lowered its head, looking suddenly weary beyond measure. On the ground, the 3 possessed men began to stir, confusion replacing the unnatural light in their eyes. 2 weeks passed like stones dropping into dark water, each day bringing new signs of the approaching catastrophe. Elias and Ruth helped the 3 men back to their homes, watching as they slowly regained themselves, with no memory of what had possessed them. Wilhelm Fischer woke in his own bed, 3 days later, wondering why his hands were blistered and his back ached. Karl Beiler found tools in his pockets that he didn't remember carrying. Even Bishop Stoltzfus seemed diminished, speaking less at church gatherings, his eyes haunted by shadows he couldn't quite recall. The community noticed. How could they not? Every farm in Ironwood Valley experienced the same impossible abundance. Crops grew with supernatural speed. Livestock behaved strangely, as if listening to voices only they could hear. Children woke from dreams speaking in ancient languages, drawing symbols on walls and floors with whatever they could find. Elias felt the changes in his own body most acutely. He could lift wagon wheels single-handedly now, work from before dawn until midnight without exhaustion. His joints no longer ached in the morning. The grey in his hair seemed to have faded, though Sarah insisted it was just the light playing tricks. He knew better. Each time he fed the horse, each time that connection flowed between them, he felt something being transferred, strength, vitality, life itself flowing from the guardian into him. But it came with a price. His sleep grew troubled, filled with visions of other worlds, other times. He saw the last keeper, a Lenape woman named Morning Dove, who had held the guardian's power for 70 years before her death. He felt her memories, her joys and sorrows, her ultimate sacrifice, when the darkness had last tested the boundary. Ruth had become his constant companion in these strange weeks. She possessed gifts that terrified and amazed him in equal measure. When she touched the earth, she could read the old patterns, see the symbols that had been carved into stones long since buried. She had found the community library's records, dusty volumes no one had opened in decades, and discovered the truth. There had been a settlement on Miller's Ridge in 1873, just as Sarah's grandmother had written. 37 families, all of them vanished in a single night. The official records claimed they'd simply moved on, seeking better land elsewhere. But Ruth found the truth in a census taker's private journal, hidden in the library's basement. "Listen to this, Papa," she said one evening, reading by candlelight at the kitchen table. The leather-bound journal lay open before her, its pages brittle with age. He writes, "Arrived at Miller's Ridge on October 15th to find only ash and silence. The houses stand empty but undamaged. The fields are scorched black, though no fire was reported. In the center of the settlement, where they held their gatherings, I found a circle of stones with markings I do not recognize. And in the woods beyond, chained to an oak tree, the largest horse I have ever seen. Dead, its flesh already rotting, but the chains remain intact. I did not linger. Some things should not be investigated by men of reason." The census taker's words confirmed what the guardian had shown them. The previous keeper had failed. The settlement had been consumed. Only the death of the guardian itself had closed the rift. And even that had required an entire community as fuel. Sarah sat across from them, her grandmother's prayer book open before her. She had spent days studying the margins, decoding notes written in a mixture of German, English and symbols that might have been native pictographs. "There's a ritual described here," Sarah said, her finger tracing faded ink. "My grandmother copied it from the Lenape woman who lived by the river, the last of her people in this valley. It's called the Keeper's Binding. But Sarah, it requires—" She paused, her voice breaking. "It requires someone to merge with the guardian, to give up their humanity and become something neither spirit nor flesh, something eternal." The weight of those words settled over them like a shroud. Hannah, who had been playing quietly in the corner, suddenly spoke without looking up from her drawing. "Papa knows," the little girl said, her pencil never stopping its movement across the paper. "Papa's known since the beginning. The horse chose him because he has a good heart, because he would choose to save everyone, even if it meant losing himself." Elias looked at his youngest daughter's drawing and felt his breath catch. She had sketched the clearing with remarkable detail, the oak tree, the chains and two figures merged into one. Half man, half something else, standing eternal watch over a doorway drawn as a tear in the paper itself. "Hannah, where did you learn to draw like that?" "The horse teaches me in my dreams," she said simply. "He's not scary, Papa. He's lonely. He's been alone for so long, guarding the door by himself. He's happy you came because now he won't be alone anymore." Jacob had been listening from the doorway, his face troubled. Since his possession, the boy had become quieter, more introspective. He spent hours in prayer, trying to cleanse himself of whatever had used him as a vessel. "There has to be another way," Jacob said. "God wouldn't ask such a sacrifice. He wouldn't demand that Papa give up his humanity to save us, wouldn't he?" Sarah's voice was soft but firm. "He demanded Abraham raise a knife to his own son. He demanded Job suffer unbearable losses. Faith is tested through sacrifice, Jacob. Sometimes the tests are harder than we can imagine. But Papa is a grown man who will make his own choice," Elias interrupted. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "And right now, that choice is to keep researching, keep preparing. We have one night left. The dark moon is tomorrow." The next morning, Bishop Stoltzfus called an emergency council meeting. The entire community gathered in the church, faces lined with worry and exhaustion. Strange things had escalated. The Fisher children had been found standing in a circle in the cornfield at midnight, holding hands and chanting. Anna Byler's entire herb garden had grown into towering plants overnight, some reaching 15 feet high. Most concerning, several men had gone missing for hours at a time, appearing later with no memory of where they'd been. The bishop stood at the pulpit, his hands gripping the wooden edges until his knuckles turned white. "Brothers and sisters, we face a trial unlike any our community has known. Some among you have whispered of curses, of dark forces at work in our valley. I tell you now, I believe these concerns are not without merit." A murmur ran through the congregation. For the bishop to acknowledge such things was unprecedented. "We must confess our sins, search our hearts, and pray for deliverance. Tonight we will hold a vigil. Every family will participate. We will pray through the darkness until the light returns." Elias felt Ruth tense beside him. A vigil meant the entire community would be vulnerable, gathered in one place, their defenses down. If the darkness wanted to make its move, it would be the perfect opportunity. After the meeting, as families dispersed, a small group approached Elias. Heinrich Lapp, Wilhelm Fischer, Johann's widow Martha, and several others. Their faces carried a mix of fear and determination. "Elias," Heinrich said, his voice low, "we know you've been going into the deep woods. We know something is out there. Some of us, we've been touched by it, worn by it. We remember fragments, impressions." Wilhelm nodded. "I remember chains, ancient iron, and eyes that saw through me, that looked at something dark living inside me." "We want to help," Martha added. "Whatever's coming, whatever's been happening, we can feel it, building." "Tomorrow night when the moon is dark," she couldn't finish, but Elias understood. "I can't ask you to risk yourselves." "You're not asking," Heinrich said firmly. "We're offering. Our faith teaches us to be separate from the world, but it also teaches us to protect our community, to stand against evil. If that's what this is, evil trying to enter our world, then we stand with you." Elias looked at these good people, these neighbors who had known him all his life, who had helped raise his children and shared their burden. In their eyes, he saw the same determination he felt in his own heart. "Then meet me at dusk," Elias said. "Bring lanterns, tools, anything that might serve as a weapon, and bring your families. I suspect the vigil at the church will be problematic. Those who are still themselves need to be elsewhere when the darkness makes its move." That afternoon, Elias made one final journey to the clearing alone. The horse sensed his approach from far off, and when he entered that sacred space, the creature's eyes held a profound sadness. "You know what you must do," the guardian's voice resonated in his mind. "You have always known from the moment you chose to help rather than walk away. I have a family, children who need me, a wife I've loved for 30 years. And you will save them all. Is that not what a father does? What a husband does? You will not die, Elias Yoder. You will transform. You will become more than you were, though different than you are now." Elias approached the chains, running his hands over the cold iron. The symbols etched into each link seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. "Will I still be me? Will I remember who I was? You will remember everything. Every moment of your life will be preserved, cherished, held eternal. But you will also carry my memories, my purpose, my endless watch. We will be one being, keeper and guardian, united as was always meant to be. And if I refuse, The horse's eyes dimmed, then the rift will tear open completely. The darkness will flood through, consuming first your community, then spreading outward. Within a year, this entire world will be theirs. Everything you love, everyone you've ever known, will become vessels for things that should not exist in your realm. Elias sank to his knees in the dead leaves. It's not fair. I've tried to live a good life, to follow the teachings, to be humble and kind. Why must this burden fall on me? Because you fed me when I was hungry. Because you showed compassion to something you feared. Because your heart is pure enough to hold this power without being corrupted by it. The chains do not choose randomly, Elias. They recognize those capable of bearing the weight. A sound from the forest made both Elias and the guardian tense. Footsteps approaching, but not human footsteps. These were rhythmic, synchronized, the march of many feet moving as one. Through the trees, Elias could see them coming. Dozens of possessed community members, their eyes reflecting that unnatural light. They know, the guardian said. They know tonight is the night. They will try to stop the ritual, or failing that, destroy me before the binding can be completed. Go, Keeper. Gather your allies. Return at moonrise. The time grows short. Elias ran through the woods faster than he'd ever moved in his life. That supernatural strength flooding his limbs. He burst from the tree line to find his family already loading their wagon. Sarah had packed their essential belongings, the children helping with grim efficiency. They're at the church, Sarah said, her face pale. Everyone who went to the vigil. Jacob rode past an hour ago and said they're all just standing there, staring at nothing, moving in patterns. He barely escaped before they noticed him. Ruth emerged from the barn with bundles of dried herbs, a bag of salt, and her grandmother's prayer book. I've been reading the ritual instructions. We'll need fire, water from the creek, and your blood, Papa. Your willing sacrifice given freely. The others? Elias asked. Henrik, Wilhelm, the families who said they'd help, hiding in their barns, their cellars, afraid to move. Jacob appeared around the corner, breathing hard. I warned as many as I could, but Papa, there are at least 50 of them at the church now. Maybe more, and they're all saying the same thing over and over. What are they saying? Free the Keeper. Break the chains. Let the darkness feed. Jacob's voice shook. They're coming, Papa. They're coming to stop you from saving us. The Yoder family worked quickly, loading supplies onto the wagon. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, decades of farm life making her hands steady, even as fear showed in her eyes. Hannah clutched her drawings, refusing to leave them behind. Each sketch showed different aspects of what was to come. Childish lines depicting truth that made Elias's heart ache. We can't outrun them, Ruth said, looking toward the road. If they're organizing, if they know what we're trying to do, they'll be watching the paths to the woods. Elias considered their options. The wagon would be too slow, too obvious. But going on foot meant leaving behind the supplies Ruth said they needed. He was about to suggest splitting up when a sound made them all freeze. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses approaching at speed. For a moment Elias feared the worst, that the possessed had found them already. But then he recognized the lead rider, Hinrich Lapp, with Wilhelm Fischer beside him. Behind them rode Martha's eldest sons, the Byler brothers, and half a dozen others, men and women both, their faces set with determination. Forgive our delay, Heinrich called, as they reined in their horses. We had to retrieve these. He gestured to the wagon following behind, loaded with tools, lengths of rope, several rifles and bundles of what looked like old iron chains. Where did you get those? Elias asked, pointing at the chain. From the old Fisher homestead, the one that burned in my grandfather's time. My father always said there was something strange about that metal, said it was forged by the old people for purposes we shouldn't question. Figured if we're fighting something supernatural, might as well use supernatural weapons. Sarah approached the group, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "You're all risking your souls doing this. The bishop will consider this abandonment of the community, possibly even witchcraft." "The bishop," Martha said quietly, "is standing in the church, speaking in a voice that isn't his own." "My Johann would have stood with Elias. I'll do no less." One of Martha's sons, a boy of perhaps 15, spoke up. "My father always said the Yoder family had good judgment. If Mr. Elias says something evil is coming, I believe him, and if he says there's a way to stop it, I'll help however I can." Elias felt tears threatening to blur his vision. These people, these faithful neighbors, were choosing to stand with him against something they barely understood. They were violating every principle of their faith's separation from worldly concerns, risking shunning and expulsion, possibly their very lives. "Then we go together," he said. "Ruth, you'll need to guide us through the ritual. Sarah, you know the prayers. Hannah." He knelt before his youngest daughter. "You've seen what happens. You know where this leads. Can you be brave?" Hannah nodded solemnly. "The horse told me not to be scared. He said, 'You'll always be my papa, even when you look different.' He promised he'd take care of you for us." The group moved out, some on horses, others in wagons, heading toward the deep woods by a back route that would avoid the church. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked disturbingly like fire. As they traveled, Elias noticed other families joining them. The Zooks, the Millers, families who had heard whispers of what was happening and chose to flee rather than attend the vigil. By the time they reached the edge of the forbidden woods, nearly 30 people had gathered. Some had brought their children, others came alone. All shared the same haunted look, the knowledge that their world was changing in ways they could never reverse. "Stay here," Elias told them. "Form a perimeter. If the possessed come, you must delay them. We need time to complete the ritual." "How long?" Heinrich asked, checking his rifle. Ruth consulted her grandmother's prayer book, her fingers tracing the faded instructions. "An hour, maybe more. The ceremony has 17 stages, and each must be performed perfectly. If we rush, if we make even one mistake, the binding won't hold." Wilhelm nodded grimly. "Then we'll give you your hour, Elias. Whatever it takes." As the family prepared to enter the clearing, Ruth stopped suddenly at the base of the ancient oak. Her foot had caught on something buried beneath the leaves and dirt. She knelt, brushing away decades of accumulated forest debris, and uncovered a wooden box, surprisingly intact, despite obvious age. "Papa, look at this." The box was about a foot square, made of oak that had somehow resisted rot. Strange symbols covered its surface, the same markings they'd seen on the chains. With trembling hands, Ruth opened it. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but readable. The first entry was dated October 1873, written in careful script. "My name is Thomas Yoder," Ruth read aloud. "I am the great-grandson of the first Yoder to settle this valley, and I have made a terrible mistake. I write this account in hope that someday someone of my blood will find it and understand what I have done." Elias felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath him. "That was my great-great-grandfather. He died when my grandfather was just a boy. The family always said he went mad in his final years, but no one knew why." Sarah moved closer as Ruth continued reading. The journal told a story that reframed everything they thought they knew. Thomas Yoder had encountered the guardian horse exactly 152 years ago. But in his entries, it wasn't a horse at all. At least not initially. It had appeared to him as a great black bird, with human eyes, speaking words that shattered his understanding of God and creation. "The creature told me it was a guardian, placed here by peoples who lived before memory, to protect our world from something beyond." Ruth read. "It said a rift existed in these woods, a tier between worlds, and every 150 years that rift tried to break open completely. The Guardian's purpose was to seal it, to hold the darkness at bay. But Thomas hadn't believed. In his fear and religious fervor, He'd seen the Guardian as a demon, something to be bound and imprisoned. With the help of an old Lenape woman he'd forced into servitude, he'd stolen the chains meant to anchor the Guardian, and had used them to imprison it instead. The woman told me I was making a grave error. Thomas's words continued through Ruth's voice. She said the Guardian would appear as what I feared most, and because I feared evil, I saw only a beast. But she warned that it would appear to my descendants as what they needed most. If you are reading this, descendant of mine, you must understand what I was too proud to see. The next entry was dated days later, and Thomas's handwriting had become shaky, desperate. The darkness is here. Without the Guardian free to perform its duty, entities from the other side are seeping through. My neighbors are no longer themselves. I see shadows with teeth moving in the corners of my vision. The Lenape woman is dead. She tried to reverse what I'd done, and they killed her for it. I buried her beside the oak tree, the Guardian watching with eyes full of sorrow and accusation. The final entries chronicled Thomas's failed attempts to free the Guardian. He'd tried to break the chains, but they'd grown stronger with his doubt. He'd tried to die, hoping his death would break the binding, but found himself unable to end his own life. The Guardian spoke to me for the last time today, Ruth read, her voice barely above a whisper. It said the chains now require what they were always meant to require, a willing keeper, someone who would choose to merge with the Guardian and share its burden. But I have used them wrong, perverted their purpose. It will hold for 150 years, growing weaker each day, until someone of my bloodline comes who has the courage I lacked. Someone who will feed the Guardian, not from obligation but from kindness. Someone who will see not what they fear, but what they need. The last page contained a single line, the ink smudged as if by tears. Forgive me, descendant, I have left you a burden no man should bear, but I pray you are stronger than I was. Elias stared at the journal, his hands shaking. Everything made sense now. Why the Guardian had appeared to him as a horse, the animal he understood and loved most. Why he'd felt compelled to help, despite his fear. Why his family had been drawn into this, each of them developing gifts that would be needed for what came next. The settlement, Sarah breathed. Miller's Ridge. That was Thomas's doing, wasn't it? His mistake caused those deaths. Ruth flipped through the remaining pages, finding a map tucked between the final entries. He drew this. Look, Papa, the settlement was built directly over another anchor point, another place where the rift was weak. When Thomas imprisoned the Guardian here, the rift had two vulnerable points instead of one. The Guardian couldn't protect both. Jacob, who had been silent throughout the reading, spoke up. So all of this, everything that's happened to our community, it's because our ancestor was afraid, because he couldn't see past his own fear to understand what was really happening. Thomas thought he was doing right, Sarah said gently. He believed he was protecting people from evil. He just didn't understand that evil wears many faces, and sometimes what looks like a monster is actually a savior. The Guardian horse stepped forward, its chains rattling. The voice in Elias's mind was softer now, tinged with something like forgiveness. Thomas Yoder was not evil, only misguided. He carried the weight of his error until his death, and his suffering was punishment enough. You, Elias Yoder, you fed me when I was bound by your ancestors' chains. You showed me the kindness he could not. That is why the binding will work with you. That is why you are the one who can finally set things right. Elias looked at his family, at his neighbors waiting at the forest's edge, at the setting sun painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. He thought about Thomas Yoder, living with the knowledge of his terrible mistake, unable to fix it, only able to hope that someday someone would. The woman Thomas mentioned, Elias said. The Lenape woman, you said he buried her here, beneath the oak, on the eastern side. Her name was Morning Song. She was the last guardian keeper of her people, the one who forged these chains to anchor me to this world. When Thomas perverted their purpose, she tried to correct his mistake. The darkness killed her for it. Ruth moved to the eastern side of the massive oak, pushing aside leaves and soil. Her fingers found something hard beneath the dirt, a flat stone, carved with symbols. "She's here, and Papa, look at this." The stone's engravings were instructions, a complete guide to the binding ritual, written in 3 languages, Lenape pictographs, German and English. Morning Song had known someone would eventually find this. She'd prepared for it even as she died. She saw the future, the Guardian explained. She knew Thomas's descendant would come. She knew he would need guidance. Every keeper develops the sight, the ability to perceive what is and what will be. She used her final moments to ensure you would not fail as Thomas did. Sarah knelt beside the stone, tracing the instructions with her finger. "This is what my grandmother wrote about in her prayer book. She must have learned some of this from someone who knew Morning Song. The ritual is complex, but..." She looked up at Elias, tears streaming down her face. "It's clear you'll survive it. Elias, your body will change, your spirit will merge with the Guardian, but you won't die. You'll be eternal." "Is that supposed to comfort me?" Elias asked, but there was no bitterness in his voice, only a weary acceptance. "I'll watch my children grow old. I'll see my grandchildren, their children, generation after generation, while I remain." Hannah slipped her small hand into his. "But you'll be here, Papa. You'll protect everyone, forever and ever. That's what heroes do." From the forest behind them came sounds that made everyone freeze, the synchronized footsteps of the possessed. Drawing closer, they'd found the trail. Time had run out for debate and second thought. Ruth moved quickly, spreading Morning Song's ritual instructions across a flat stone where everyone could see them. Her hands worked with surprising steadiness as she pulled items from her bag, the dried herbs, the salt, the candles they'd brought. Sarah stood beside her, consulting both the grandmother's prayer book and the stone carvings, comparing instructions to ensure they understood every step. "The ritual has 17 stages," Ruth said, her voice carrying authority beyond her 16 years. "Each one builds on the last. If we break the sequence, we'll have to start over, and I don't think we'll get a second chance." Elias looked toward the forest edge where their neighbors had formed a defensive line. He could hear the possessed drawing closer, their footsteps creating an unnatural rhythm that made the hair on his neck stand. Henrik stood at the front, rifle ready but his face troubled. These were his friends and family coming toward them. After all, even if something else wore them now. "How long?" Elias called to Ruth. "An hour, maybe more if complications arise. Then we begin now." He turned to Jacob. "Son, I need you to help protect your mother and sisters. Can you do that?" Jacob's jaw set with determination. "I won't let anything happen to them, Papa. I promise." Sarah pulled a deerskin scroll from her pack, another item her grandmother had preserved, passed down through generations. The skin was old but intact, covered in symbols that glowed faintly in the fading light. These were the words of binding, written in 3 languages so that no matter who found them, they could be read and understood. "We begin with purification," Sarah said, reading from the scroll. "The keeper must be cleansed of doubt, fear and hesitation. Only absolute willingness can create a true binding." She handed Elias a clay cup, filled with water from the creek, mixed with herbs that gave it a bitter scent. He drank without question, feeling the liquid burn down his throat. Immediately his mind cleared, doubts falling away like shed skin. He understood with perfect clarity what he was about to do, what he was about to become, and found himself at peace with it. Ruth drew a circle around the oak tree, using salt mixed with ash, creating a boundary between worlds. As she worked, she chanted words in the old language, phonetics written in her grandmother's prayer book. The air inside the circle began to shimmer, as if heat rose from invisible flames. Hannah stood at the circle's edge, her small voice joining her sister. She held her drawings, and one by one she placed them at the cardinal points: north, south, east, west. Each picture showed a different aspect of the Guardian, a different form it had taken throughout the centuries. As each drawing touched the ground, it began to glow with soft light. The possessed burst through the tree line just as Ruth completed the circle. 50 or more of them, moving in perfect synchronization, their eyes reflecting that horrible unnatural light. At their head walked Bishop Stoltzfus, his face twisted into something that barely resembled the kind old man they'd known. "Stop them!" Henrik shouted, and the defensive line moved to intercept. What followed was chaos. The possessed moved with inhuman speed and strength, throwing themselves at the defenders without concern for the bodies they inhabited. Henrik's rifle fired once, twice, but he aimed for legs and shoulders. He couldn't bring himself to kill men he'd known since childhood, even knowing they weren't truly themselves. Wilhelm fought hand to hand with Karl Beiler, tears streaming down his face as he wrestled his friend to the ground. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "Karl, I'm so sorry." Martha and her sons formed a secondary line, using ropes to bind any possessed who broke through. They worked with grim efficiency, tying hands and feet, dragging the struggling bodies away from the circle where the ritual continued. Inside the circle, unaware of the violence happening just yards away, Sarah continued the ritual. Second stage, the offering of earth. The keeper must give something of himself to anchor the bond. Elias knelt before the oak tree, pulling out his hand-carved Bible box. This small wooden container had been with him every day of his life since his grandfather placed it in his hands at age 13. Inside were the scripture verses, the tangible connection to his faith and heritage. "I offer this," he said, placing the box at the tree's roots. "A piece of my past, freely given." The moment the box touched the ground, it began to sink into the soil as if being pulled by invisible hands. The earth accepted it, and Elias felt something shift within him, a loosening, the first thread of his old life being cut. Ruth moved to the third stage, her voice steady despite the sounds of combat nearby. The offering of air. The keeper must speak his truth, must voice what he fears and what he hopes. Elias stood, facing the guardian. "I fear losing myself. I fear my children will forget who I was. I fear that what I become will be so different that Sarah won't recognize the man she married." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I hope that love transcends form. I hope that protecting my family, my community, my world is worth any sacrifice. I hope that when my children are old and grey, they'll tell their grandchildren about their father with pride, not sorrow." The wind suddenly picked up, swirling around the circle with increasing intensity. It carried his words outward, spreading them like seeds across the valley. Everyone present heard them, the defenders, the possessed, even those hiding in their homes, miles away. They all heard Elias Yoder's truth. Sarah's hands trembled as she prepared the fourth stage. The offering of fire. The keeper must burn away his attachment to mortality, must accept that his time as a simple man ends tonight. She lit a small fire in the center of the circle, feeding it with dried sage and cedar. The smoke rose in a straight column, despite the howling wind. Elias stepped into the smoke, letting it envelop him. He felt it penetrate his skin, his lungs, burning away something essential and replacing it with something new. His vision shifted. Suddenly he could see the rift, a massive tear in reality that had been invisible before. It pulsed like a wound, dark things pressing against it from the other side. And he could see the possessed, not as people, but as vessels, hollow shells filled with fragments of those dark things. Papa. Hannah's cry broke through his trance. She pointed to the eastern side of the defensive line where the possessed had broken through. 3 of them were charging toward the circle, their movements inhumanly fast. Jacob intercepted the first, tackling him around the waist. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling across the ground. The second was stopped by Wilhelm, who threw a rope around her neck and pulled her back. But the third, a young woman Elias recognized as one of the Lapp daughters, made it through. She lunged for the salt circle, trying to break the boundary. The moment her foot touched the line, she screamed, a sound that came from something far deeper and more ancient than human vocal cords could produce. The salt glowed white-hot, repelling her, but the circle's edge had been disturbed. A gap appeared, barely an inch wide, but enough. Dark tendrils began seeping through that gap, reaching toward the ritual space like seeking fingers. Ruth immediately began rechanting the boundary spell, trying to repair the damage, but the tendrils moved faster. They wrapped around Hannah's ankle, and the little girl cried out, "No!" Sarah rushed to her daughter, grabbing the child and trying to pull her free. But the tendrils held fast, and more were coming through the widening gap. The guardian horse reared, its chains rattling with a sound like thunder. The ritual must continue. We're at the threshold. If we stop now, the rift will tear completely open. But Hannah, Sarah pleaded, "We'll be protected," the guardian finished. "Trust me, Sarah Yoder. Trust what you are about to witness." Elias didn't hesitate. He moved to the fifth stage even as his daughter screamed. The offering of water, the keeper gives his tears, his sorrow, his humanity. Sarah pulled a small vial from her pocket, the one where she'd collected Elias's tears days ago. She poured it onto the roots of the oak tree. The moment the liquid touched the ancient wood, something extraordinary happened. The tree began to glow from within, its bark becoming translucent, revealing the intricate network of roots that spread beneath the clearing, and wrapped around those roots, protecting them, were the bones of Morning Song, the Lenape woman who had died trying to fix Thomas Yoder's mistake. She had been buried here, not as punishment, but as protection, her spirit becoming part of the guardian's anchor. Light erupted from the tree, blinding in its intensity. The dark tendrils holding Hannah shriveled and retreated, unable to withstand that pure radiance. The gap in the salt circle sealed itself, stronger than before. And in that light, everyone present saw the truth. The guardian wasn't just a horse or a spirit. It was the combined essence of every keeper who had ever served, every sacrifice made across millennia. Morning Song was there, and the keepers before her, stretching back to the beginning of time when the first humans learned that their world needed protection from things that should not be. "The offering of blood," Ruth said, reading from the scroll with new understanding. "The keeper must willingly give his life force to merge with the eternal." Elias stepped forward, pulling a knife from his belt. He didn't hesitate, drawing the blade across his palm. Blood welled up, bright red in the strange light. He pressed his bleeding hand against the guardian's flank. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Power surged through him, ancient and vast. He felt the consciousness of every previous keeper flooding into his mind, their memories, their loves, their losses, their centuries of vigilant watch. He felt Morning Song's fierce determination, her pride in her people, her forgiveness of Thomas despite his mistake. He felt the Lenape warrior before her, who had guarded the rift for 70 years, and before that, others stretching back through countless generations. But most of all, he felt the guardian itself. Not an animal, not a spirit, but something in between, a force of nature, ancient and patient, that had chosen to protect humanity, not from obligation but from something resembling love. "The remaining stages must happen quickly," Sarah said, her voice urgent. The defensive line was faltering. More possessed were breaking through, and the defenders were exhausted. "Ruth, Hannah, stand with me. We'll speak the binding words together." The three women formed a triangle around Elias and the guardian. They began to chant in unison, their voices creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible. The words were in the old language, but Elias understood them now. They spoke of duty and choice, of sacrifice and transformation, of the eternal watch that someone must keep. Stage by stage, the ritual progressed. The offering of spirit, the offering of will, the offering of time. With each stage, Elias felt more of his old self falling away and something new being built in its place. His body began to change, subtle at first, but increasingly obvious. His skin took on a faint luminescence. His eyes shifted, becoming deeper, older, holding centuries in their gaze. Jacob appeared at the circle's edge, blood on his face from the fighting. "Papa, they're overwhelming us. We need—" He stopped, staring at his father. "Papa, I'm here, son," Elias said, but his voice had changed. It held depths it hadn't before, harmonics that suggested multiple voices speaking as one. "Hold them a little longer. We're almost finished." The 14th stage, the 15th, the 16th, the chains around the Guardian began to glow, shifting from iron grey to brilliant gold. They were transforming from bonds of imprisonment to bonds of willing connection. Elias could feel them wrapping around his own spirit now, anchoring him to this place, to this purpose. The 17th and final stage required something no ritual instruction could fully capture. Sarah stepped forward with a piece of blessed cloth, its edges embroidered with silver thread that caught and held moonlight, despite the darkness. In the center, written in ink that glowed with its own light, was a single word in the old language. "Okowisam," she read, her voice breaking with emotion. "He wakes us," the Guardian's true name, the name given when the first keeper and the first Guardian became one. She placed the cloth in Elias's remaining hand, the one not pressed against the Guardian's flank. The moment his fingers closed around it, the transformation accelerated beyond anything they could have anticipated. Elias gasped as his body and the Guardian's began to merge, not physically, but spiritually, energetically. He could feel the horse's ancient consciousness flowing into his own, and his human awareness expanding to encompass the Guardian's vast perspective. He experienced everything simultaneously, his 53 years as Elias Yoder and the countless millennia of the Guardian's existence. He saw the world as the Guardian saw it, the rift not as a simple tear, but as a complex wound across multiple dimensions, constantly probing for weakness, constantly testing. He saw the darkness beyond it, entities so alien to human comprehension that looking at them directly could shatter a mind. And he saw why the Guardian had to exist, why someone had to stand watch forever, never resting, never faltering. "Papa!" Hannah's scream broke through his transformation. The possessed had broken the defensive line completely. They poured into the clearing like a flood, Bishop Stoltzfus leading them, his face no longer even attempting to appear human. Dozens of community members, all of them vessels now for the dark things that wanted through. But the ritual was complete. The final stage had been spoken, and Elias Yoder stood in the center of the salt circle, no longer quite man, not quite Guardian, but something new and terrible and magnificent. The chains around the oak tree shattered, not with violence, but with a sound like a sigh of relief. The golden links dissolved into pure light, reforming around Elias's own form. But these weren't chains of imprisonment. These were chains of connection, binding him to the land, to the rift, to his eternal duty. His form shifted between human and equine, never settling completely on either. One moment he stood as a man, that's he was the great black horse. Then both at once, a chimera of flesh and spirit. His eyes blazed with that golden light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of ages. Enough. That single word rippled outward like a shockwave. The possessed froze mid-stride, their dark passengers suddenly aware of what they faced. This wasn't the weakened Guardian they'd expected, barely holding on after a century and a half of imprisonment. This was a newly bound keeper at full, channeling the strength of all who had come before. "You will not pass," Elias Okuisam declared, his voice harmonizing with itself. "This gate is sealed by my blood, my will, and my choice. I stand eternal watch, and you are not welcome here." The possessed began to scream, not with human voices, but with the voices of the entities within them, forced to confront something that could actually resist them. One by one, the dark presences were torn from their human hosts, pulled back toward the rift like smoke being sucked through a keyhole. Wilhelm Fischer collapsed to his knees, suddenly himself again. Karl Byler blinked, looking around in confusion. The Lapp children fell unconscious but breathing normally. All across the clearing, possessed community members were being freed, the darkness driven out of them by the Guardian's power. Only Bishop Stoltzfurs remained standing, his body rigid, fighting the expulsion. The entity within him had been there longer than the others, had rooted deeper. It spoke through his mouth with multiple voices overlaid. You think you've won, Keeper? You think binding yourself here changes anything? We are eternal. We are patient. In another 100 years, another Keeper will stand where you stand, and eventually one will fail. One will always fail. Elias Okawesen moved forward, his form solidifying into something that was both man and guardian combined. He stood taller than he had as simply Elias, his body radiating that golden light. The chains of binding glowed around him, no longer restraints but symbols of his willing commitment. You're wrong, he said, and now his voice carried not just authority but certainty. Every Keeper who has stood watch understood what you refused to accept. We don't just defend against you, we learn from you. Each time you press against this boundary, each time you try to break through, we understand you better. We grow stronger while you remain unchanged. He reached out, placing his hand on Bishop Stoltzfus's forehead. And this man, this good man, whose body you've stolen, he doesn't belong to you. None of them do. Power flowed from the Guardian Keeper into the bishop's form. The dark entity screamed, thrashing, trying to hold on, but Elias remembered something from the flood of ancient memories. The entities could only possess those who harbored doubt, fear, or darkness in their own hearts. They needed an invitation, however unconscious. Nathaniel, Elias spoke directly to the man beneath the possession. I know you're in there. I know you doubt yourself, doubt your worthiness to lead our community. You think your strictness, your harsh interpretations of the ordinance make you unworthy of God's love, but that doubt is what let this thing in. You have to let it go. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Bishop Stoltzfus's eyes flickered, showing a hint of their normal brown color beneath the reflecting light. His mouth worked, forming words in his own voice. I tried to be good, tried to keep everyone safe by keeping them separate, pure, but I was afraid that any deviation, any softness would lead us astray. Fear and faith can coexist, Elias said gently, but fear alone opens doors that should stay closed. Choose faith, Nathaniel. Choose trust in the goodness you've always tried to protect. The bishop's body convulsed one final time, and the dark entity was expelled in a rush of cold air that made everyone in the clearing shiver. The old man collapsed, but Heinrich caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. The bishop was unconscious, but breathing, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for weeks. With the last of the possessed freed, Elias turned his attention to the rift itself. He could see it clearly now, a jagged tear in reality that pulsed with malevolent intent. Dark shapes pressed against it from the other side, testing its strength, probing for any weakness. This is what I guard now, he said to his family, who had gathered at the circle's edge. This moment, this battle, it's happening every second of every day. The rift never stops trying to open. The darkness never stops pushing, and I never stop holding it closed. Ruth stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Papa, will you remember us? Will you still be you? He smiled, and it was Elias's smile, warm and familiar despite the strangeness of his new form. I'll remember everything, daughter. Every bedtime story I read to you, every time you helped me in the fields, Every proud moment when I watched you grow from a curious child into a wise young woman. Those memories don't disappear. They become part of the guardian's strength. Sarah approached slowly, her hand extended. Elias met her touch, his fingers interlacing with hers. For a moment he solidified completely into his human form, looking almost exactly as he had that morning, save for the light in his eyes. 30 years, she whispered. 30 good years we had together. I thought we might have 30 more, growing old side by side. But this is more important than my selfish desires. Not selfish, human. He kissed her forehead gently. And I haven't left you, Sarah. I'll always be here, watching over the farm, protecting the valley, keeping our family safe. I just won't be visible most of the time. Jacob and Hannah joined them, creating a family embrace that defied the strangeness of the situation. For several heartbeats, they were simply the Yoder family, holding each other, saying goodbye without words to what they had been, and accepting what they would become. The moment of family intimacy ended as the rift pulsed with renewed violence. The entities on the other side, sensing their failure to possess the community, were attempting a more direct approach. The tier widened visibly, and tendrils of pure darkness began seeping through. Not trying to possess anyone this time, but simply to exist in this world, to spread corruption and chaos. Elias released his family and turned to face his true enemy. His form shifted again, becoming larger, more imposing. The guardian aspect took precedence, and the great black horse stood in the clearing, chains of golden light spiraling around its body. But its eyes remained human, filled with determination and love. "Go," he commanded his family. "Take everyone who can walk and leave this clearing. What happens next? You shouldn't witness." Sarah hesitated, but Ruth gently pulled her mother away. "He needs to do this, Mama. We have to trust him." The defenders and the freed community members began retreating, carrying those who couldn't walk on their own. Henrik lingered at the forest edge, watching as the keeper prepared to seal the rift completely. Elias Yoder approached the tier in reality, each step deliberate and measured. The darkness reached for him eagerly, sensing his power, wanting to consume it, but the chains around him flared brighter, repelling the probing tendrils. He spoke words in the old language, phrases taught to him through the memories of countless previous keepers. Each word was a binding, a sealing, a reinforcement of the boundary between worlds. The rift began to shrink, slowly at first, then faster as his power grew. But closing it completely required more than words and will. It required sacrifice. Elias understood this now, understanding that had come with the memories of Morning Song and those before her. To truly seal the rift, the keeper had to anchor it not just to the land, but to themselves. They had to become part of the barrier, existing simultaneously in both worlds, forever holding them apart. He plunged his hands directly into the rift, and agony unlike anything he'd ever experienced flooded his senses. The darkness tried to pull him through, to drag him into that realm of hungry entities. But the golden chains held him fast, anchoring him to his world, to his duty, to the people he'd sworn to protect. The rift screamed. There was no other word for the sound it made as it was forced closed. Reality itself seemed to warp and flex around Elias's form. He felt his physical body beginning to dissolve, becoming something less substantial, but more permanent. He was becoming part of the land itself, part of the very fabric of this place. Images flashed through his mind. He saw the farm thriving under Jacob's care. He saw Ruth becoming a teacher, documenting the old ways and the new understanding, creating books that would guide future generations. He saw Hannah growing into a woman with her mother's strength and his own compassion. He saw Sarah living a long life, still visiting the oak tree every week to talk to the husband who remained but was changed. He saw generations of Yoders born and dying, always with someone who could sense his presence, always with someone who understood that they were protected. He saw the community accepting what had happened, incorporating it into their faith, rather than rejecting it. He saw Ironwood Valley becoming a place of safety, where the darkness could never take root. And he saw himself, standing eternal watch, sometimes appearing as a man, sometimes as the great horse, sometimes as something in between, always vigilant, always present, always loving the people he'd given everything to save. The rift closed with a sound like the world sighing in relief. The tear in reality sealed so completely that no trace of it remained visible, but Elias knew it was still there, would always be there, pressing against the boundary, and he would always be there too, holding it closed through force of will and the power of his sacrifice. His form stabilized into something permanent. He stood as a man, but one marked by his transformation. His skin held a faint luminescence that was visible only in darkness. His eyes showed depths that spoke of ages beyond human comprehension. The golden chains, no longer visible to most, bound him to the oak tree, to the clearing, to this point in space and time where he would stand watch for eternity. As dawn broke over the valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the guardian keeper stood beneath the ancient oak, alone but not lonely, changed but not destroyed, eternal and at peace. 3 months after the equinox, the community of Ironwood Valley had settled into a new rhythm of life. The possessed remembered nothing of their time under the darkness's control, waking as if from long, troubled dream. Wilhelm Fischer returned to tending his cows, which now gave milk sweet and plentiful. Karl Beiler walked his fields by daylight, no longer compelled to wander at midnight. Even Bishop Stoltzfors seemed changed, his sermons softer now, speaking more of love and less of judgment. The strange abundance that had marked the weeks of possession faded, replaced by natural blessings. Crops grew at normal rates, but yielded well. Animals behaved as animals should. Children spoke only in languages they were taught. Yet everyone knew, even if they didn't speak of it openly, that something fundamental had changed in their valley. Sarah Yoder ran the farm with quiet strength, aided by her 3 children who had matured beyond their years. Ruth had become the community's unofficial historian, documenting everything that had happened in careful journals that would be preserved for future generations. She had also begun teaching, helping other young people understand the old ways and how they connected to the new understanding. Jacob worked the land with his father's dedication, finding that the soil seemed to respond to his touch in ways it never had before. The wheat grew straight and strong under his care, the garden flourished, and visitors to the Yoder farm always remarked on how peaceful the place felt, how the very air seemed cleaner, lighter somehow. Hannah still saw her father regularly, though others rarely did. She would skip out to the ancient oak in the woods, where a great black horse often waited, and spend hours talking to him about her day, her dreams, her small triumphs and disappointments. Sometimes he appeared as the horse, sometimes as the man her father had been, and sometimes as something neither fully one nor the other. Every Sunday after church, Sarah made the walk to the clearing. She brought flowers from her garden and placed them at the oak's roots, at the spot where morning song rested beneath the earth. And she would talk, telling the tree about the week's events, about the children's accomplishments, about how much she missed sharing Rosie on the porch at sunrise. And always, when she finished speaking, a hand would materialize briefly from light and shadow. It would touch her cheek with infinite gentleness, the way Elias had touched her for 30 years of marriage. Then it would fade, leaving her smiling through tears, comforted by the knowledge that he remained. The note that now hung from the oak tree had been written by Elias in the first days after his transformation. Ruth could read it, as could Hannah and a few others with the gift of seeing. It was written in 3 languages, just as Morning Song had done, ensuring that whoever needed its message would understand. I remain, not as I was, but as I must be. My love for you endures beyond form. Keep faith. Remember, I watch over you always, in this world and from the boundary of the next. The darkness will not claim you while I stand. This I promise forever. EY. The community had learned that some sacrifices don't mean endings, they mean transformations, continuations in different forms. They learned that protecting others, even at great personal cost, was perhaps the highest expression of love, and they learned that their valley was special, guarded by one of their own, who had chosen duty over comfort, eternity over mortality. In the woods that had once been feared, children now played without danger. In the fields that had seen supernatural corruption, crops grew true and healthy, and in the hearts of every person in Ironwood Valley lived the understanding that they were watched over by Elias Yoder, who had been a poor farmer with a good heart, and who had become something far more. The guardians stood eternal watch in the clearing, both ancient warrior and humble father, forever keeping the darkness at bay. And when night fell and the moon rose over the valley, those who looked carefully could sometimes see a great black horse standing beneath the oak tree, its eyes full of stars, its presence a promise that some would always stand between the innocent and the evil that desired to consume them. This was the story of how one man's compassion and courage saved not just a community, but a world, and how love, in the end, transcends even the boundaries between life and eternity.